She thought she was just another child at a charity event. He thought he was just handing out toys. But when a 5-year-old girl looked the billionaire CEO in the eyes and said, "I don't want a gift, I want a dad," the entire park went silent, and his life changed forever. The summer air in Seattle was unusually warm that afternoon, carrying the scent of cotton candy and fresh grass through the sprawling amusement park that had been transformed into something out of a child's dream. Music echoed from spinning carousels. Laughter filled the skies as roller coasters rushed past. Children in colorful clothes darted from ride to ride, their arms full of toys and stuffed animals. Balloons floated above the crowd like floating candy drops. In the center of it all, behind velvet ropes and a wall of cameras and flashing lights, stood Nick Bennett, billionaire, CEO, and the man responsible for the entire spectacle. He looked exactly how the media loved to describe him. Tall, commanding, effortlessly charismatic, with carefully styled brown hair, piercing brown eyes, and a posture that exuded control. His light-colored shirt was crisply pressed, the sleeves rolled to the elbows to make him seem more approachable for the press. Dark, tailored trousers completed the look. Casual but powerful, every inch of him the image of a man in charge. Today, though, wasn't about profit or press. At least that's what Nick told himself. The charity event was his idea. A free day of rides, toys, food, and games for underprivileged children from all across the city. No cameras were supposed to be involved, but his PR team had insisted. After all, nothing screamed compassionate leadership like a billionaire gifting teddy bears to wide-eyed orphans under a Ferris wheel. But beneath the smiles and photo ops, Nick couldn't shake the feeling that none of this meant anything. He moved through the crowd like a king among commoners, handing out toys and taking pictures, shaking tiny hands. Everyone smiled back at him, but none of it touched him. Not really. He had long mastered the art of giving without feeling. He had built empires, saved companies, crushed markets. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped connecting with anything real. Until he saw her. She was standing near one of the quieter corners of the park. A little girl in a white dress with lace sleeves and pink sneakers, hugging her arms around herself as other children rushed by. Her hair was light, nearly golden, and fell in soft waves around her face. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just watched. Nick walked over without knowing why. He held a white stuffed bunny in one hand, part of the stack his team had prepared for him to distribute. He knelt down in front of the girl, offering the toy with his most practiced smile. "Hey there," he said warmly. "This little guy's looking for a home. You think he'd be happy with you?" The girl didn't reach for it. She just looked at him, those large, soft brown eyes locking with his. Her expression was solemn, but not afraid. Quiet, almost too grown up. Then in the kind of silence that makes the world lean in to listen, she spoke. "Sir," she said in a calm, serious voice, "I don't want toys. I want a dad." The words hit Nick with the force of a punch he didn't see coming. Everything around him froze. The carousel behind them kept spinning. Children kept laughing. His PR team stood nearby, still smiling for photos, unaware that time had stopped for him completely. Nick blinked. "What did you say?" She repeated it, just as softly. "I don't want toys. I want a dad." And that's when he truly saw her, not just as another child in a sea of children, not as a PR opportunity, not as someone to hand a bunny to and move on. He saw her eyes wide and searching, so familiar it made his chest tighten. Before he could say anything else, a woman came rushing over. Young, beautiful, flustered. Blonde hair pulled into a neat bun, bright blue eyes wide with panic. "I'm so sorry," she said, breathless. "She didn't mean to bother you. Sophie, sweetie, come here." The girl, Sophie, didn't move. Nick stood up slowly, his gaze now shifting to the woman. Something flickered in the back of his mind. A memory, a feeling, and then it hit him. He knew her. Not just vaguely, not from the press or a business meeting. He knew her. From another life 5 years ago, from a night that had meant far more than he'd ever let himself believe. He looked at the woman, and she looked right back. And in that charged, impossible moment, 1,000 questions rushed through him, none with answers. But one thing was already painfully, unmistakably clear. This wasn't just any girl. And this wasn't just any moment. This was something else entirely. Nick stood motionless as the woman approached, the sounds of the amusement park fading into a dull hum behind him. His gaze remained locked on the little girl, Sophie, who was now silently holding the white stuffed bunny he had offered her just moments ago. Her words still echoed in his mind. I don't want toys. I want a dad. He turned to the woman, and for a second, they simply stared at each other. Her bright blue eyes were wide with disbelief. She looked just as he remembered, though older, more tired, her beauty more grounded, more real. She had once been effortlessly radiant. Now she was luminous in a different way, worn but strong, like someone who had carried too much and kept going anyway. Emily, he asked, his voice hoarse, like the air had suddenly turned too thick to speak through. She nodded slowly, pressing her lips together. Hi, Nick. Everything tilted. It had been 5 years since he last saw her, since that night in Chicago when they'd met at a business networking gala. She had been working PR for a startup that was pitching to his company. He hadn't even planned to attend that night, but something, her smile, her voice, the way she didn't care who he was, had drawn him in. They talked for hours. They drank cheap champagne on the hotel balcony. They watched the city lights blur into something dreamlike. And in a rare moment of vulnerability, Nick had allowed himself to forget the fortress he had built around his life. They spent the night together. Nothing planned, nothing promised. And by morning she was gone. No note, no goodbye. He had assumed she didn't want more. And he, being who he was, convinced himself that was fine. Now here she was, with a little girl who looked exactly like him. He tried to steady himself. She's mine, isn't she? Emily didn't answer at first. She bent down, brushed a lock of hair from Sophie's forehead, and took her hand gently. Sophie, sweetheart, she said softly. Can you go sit on the bench for a minute? Mommy needs to talk. Sophie hesitated, eyes flitting between them, then nodded and walked a few steps away. The bunny still clutched tightly to her chest. Emily turned back to him, her face tense, her voice shaking. Yes, she's yours. Nick felt like the ground had dropped out from under him. There was no drama in the way she said it, no accusation, just truth, laid bare like a wound. Why didn't you tell me? Her eyes filled with something unreadable. I wanted to, 1,000 times, but you left. You never called. You never wrote. And she paused, swallowing hard. I didn't want to force anything. I didn't want you to feel trapped. Nick shook his head slowly, trying to process it all. I had no idea. I know, she said quietly. I could have tried harder. Maybe I should have. But when I found out I was pregnant, you were already back in New York. You were everywhere on the news. Acquisitions, mergers, Forbes covers. You were on top of the world. And I was just... She looked down at her shoes. A girl you slept with once. His heart twisted painfully. You were never just that. She looked up at him again. Maybe not to you, but to your world. I didn't know where I fit. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing slightly, mind spinning. Does she know? She knows her father's name. She knows that you're successful, that we met once, and that you didn't know about her. I never lied to her, but I also didn't think it was fair to fill her head with expectations. Until today, she never asked. Nick looked over at Sophie, sitting on the bench, her legs swinging, the bunny in her lap. She looked so small, so still, so heartbreakingly familiar. And today, he asked. She saw you on the stage, Emily said. Saw the toys, the cameras, all the kids laughing. She turned to me and asked, is that my daddy? And then she just walked up to you. I didn't expect her to say what she did. He stared at Emily. I don't care about any of the media stuff, or expectations, or timing. She's my daughter, and I've missed 5 years of her life. I know, Emily said, and so have I, because I've been doing this alone. The words hung between them. Not bitter, just true. Nick exhaled slowly. I want to be part of her life. Emily's shoulders tensed. It's not that easy. Why not? He asked, more desperate than angry. Because she's 5, and she doesn't need to be another headline. She doesn't need a father who drops in for a photo op and disappears again. You think I'd do that? I don't know, she said honestly. 5 years ago, I barely knew you, and now everything's different. Nick looked at her, and for a moment, he wasn't the CEO or the billionaire, or the man behind the polished smile. He was just a man who had been told, far too late, that he had a child. "I don't want to be a visitor, Emily," he said quietly. "I want to be a father. For real. Whatever it takes." They stood in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the amusement park returning slowly to their awareness. Sophie looked up from the bench and gave a small wave, as if checking whether they were okay. Emily turned to him one last time. "Then prove it," she said. And in that moment, Nick knew that this wasn't going to be fixed with flowers or private jets. He would have to earn it. All of it. Trust. Time. Love. But he also knew something else. He was ready. Later that evening, the laughter and music of the amusement park had faded into the distance. The lights of the carousel still spun in the background, glowing like soft orbs against the dusky sky. But the crowd had thinned. Volunteers were packing up leftover toys, vendors were shutting down food stalls, and parents were ushering tired, sugar-filled children toward waiting buses. Nick sat on a quiet bench just outside the event grounds, elbows on his knees, staring at the gravel beneath his polished shoes. His expensive watch gleamed in the warm light, but he hadn't checked the time in hours. His mind wasn't in meetings, mergers, or stock trends tonight. It was somewhere entirely new. Somewhere he had never allowed himself to go before. Across from him, Emily sat with Sophie curled up beside her, asleep with her head resting gently on her mother's thigh. Her fingers still clutched the white bunny Nick had given her. Emily stroked her daughter's hair absently, her expression soft and tired. "She was up all night last night," Emily murmured, not looking at him. "She was so excited for today. I think she thought maybe she'd see you, even before she knew exactly who you were." Nick didn't answer right away. He couldn't. His throat was tight. His chest felt heavy. "I missed everything," he said finally, his voice low. "Her first word, her first steps, the way she looks when she sleeps. I missed 5 years." Emily looked at him, her face unreadable in the dim light. "You didn't know. That doesn't make it hurt less." She didn't argue with him, just sat there quietly, as if she too were still processing everything that had unraveled in the last few hours. He leaned back against the bench, staring at the stars starting to peek through the clouds. "Tell me about her," he said. Emily hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "She's smart and sensitive. She notices everything, even when I think she's not listening. She asks questions I can't always answer. She loves animals, especially horses, even though she's never ridden one. She draws all the time. She talks to her stuffed animals like they're real. She has this way of looking at people, like she sees straight through them." Nick smiled faintly. "She sounds amazing." "She is." He looked over at her, hesitating. "And you? How have you been?" That question landed heavier than he expected. Emily gave a soft sigh, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I've been surviving," she said. "It hasn't been easy. Rent's high. Childcare's expensive. I had to leave my job when Sophie was 3 because she got sick a lot. I work part-time now doing copywriting from home. It's not glamorous, but it keeps us afloat." Nick's heart twisted. He couldn't imagine Emily, once so vibrant, driven, confident, living under that kind of pressure day after day. "I could have helped," he said quietly. "If I'd known." "I didn't want your help," she interrupted gently but firmly. "Not like that. Not as a check in the mail. I needed, we needed someone real. Someone who was going to stay." Nick nodded slowly. "I want to stay." "You say that now," she replied. "But you live in another world, Nick. A world of jets and boardrooms and luxury hotels. What happens when the cameras turn off? When it's not easy anymore?" "I've done hard things before," he said. "This isn't a hostile takeover or a quarterly report," Emily said softly. "This is a little girl with a heart too big for her body, who's already had to ask one stranger to be her father. You can't walk away from that once it starts." The air was still for a moment. The weight of her words settled into his chest like stone. "I'm not walking away," he said. She looked at him, eyes clear, full of something somewhere between challenge and hope. "Then we'll see." They sat in silence again, the three of them, two adults with years between them, and a little girl sleeping between worlds, together for the first time, not sure what to say, but somehow knowing they were exactly where they were, supposed to be. Eventually, Emily shifted slightly, trying not to wake Sophie. "We should go. It's late." Nick stood, hesitating. "Can I walk you to your car?" Emily nodded. He carried Sophie gently in his arms as they walked toward the parking lot. She stirred only once, mumbling softly in her sleep, and Nick felt something break open inside him. She fit so perfectly in his arms, as if she'd always belonged there. At Emily's old sedan, he helped buckle Sophie into her seat. Before closing the door, he paused, watching her sleeping face. A single tear rolled down his cheek. "I'll see you again soon," he whispered. As he stepped back, Emily met his eyes. "I believe in second chances, Nick, but only if you show up." "I will," he said, "every time." Then she got into the car, started the engine, and drove off into the night. Nick stood in the empty parking lot long after the taillights disappeared, the sounds of the amusement park long gone. And for the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him. A purpose, a fire, a tether to something real. He didn't know exactly how to be a father, but he knew one thing. He was going to learn. The next morning, Nick woke up earlier than usual. The sun had barely crept over the Seattle skyline, painting his penthouse apartment in soft shades of gold and peach. But sleep was already far behind him. He had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, running memories and moments through his mind like a reel of film. Sophie's voice, Emily's eyes, the weight of his daughter asleep in his arms. For the first time in years, Nick didn't start his day by checking his phone or answering a flood of emails from global partners. The phone sat untouched on the marble nightstand. Today, the company could wait. Profits could wait. Even the boardroom could wait, because something far more urgent had taken hold of him. He needed to know more about Sophie, about the life she lived without him, and about how he could make up for the years he had lost. He wasn't naive enough to think a few words or gifts would make it right. But maybe if he started now, today, he could build something real. He pulled on a dark sweater and jeans, for once not bothering with tailored suits or polished shoes, and left the apartment without telling his assistant where he was going. He didn't need anyone scheduling this. This wasn't business. This was personal. Emily lived in a quiet part of the city, a modest residential area with narrow streets, old trees, and small townhouses that leaned into one another like old friends. He found her address easily, though he wasn't even sure if she'd be home. He hadn't called. He wanted to see them, unfiltered, unsanitized, the way their life really was. As he pulled up in front of the building, he hesitated. It felt strange, humbling even, to be here. His world was marble lobbies and glass elevators, private doormen and ocean views. This was different, smaller, quieter, real. He stood at the door for a moment before finally knocking. A few seconds passed. Then the door opened. Not all the way, just a cautious crack. Emily peeked out, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, her eyes immediately wary. "Nick? I'm sorry for not calling," he said quickly. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about everything. I had to see you, both of you." Emily opened the door a little more and stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was small but warm, lived in. There were drawings on the fridge, scattered children's books on the coffee table, and a faint smell of vanilla and laundry in the air. "Sophie's still asleep," Emily said, crossing her arms as she leaned against the doorway. "She was exhausted after yesterday." Nick nodded, his voice quiet. "Can we talk before she wakes up?" Emily gave a slight nod and gestured to the small couch. He sat, noticing the wear on the fabric, the toys tucked underneath, the blanket folded over the back. All the signs of a life he hadn't been part of, but wanted to be now. "I haven't stopped thinking about her since I left that parking lot," he said. She's incredible. I don't even know how to describe it, and I can't believe I've missed so much." Emily sat in the chair across from him, legs crossed, guarded but not hostile. "She's everything to me," she said, "and I've done my best. But it's been hard." "I want to help," Nick said immediately. "Not just financially. I know that's the easy part. I want to be in her life, consistently, fully. I want to know her, to be a father." Emily looked at him for a long moment and then said something that knocked the air from his lungs. "She's sick." Nick froze. "What?" Emily exhaled slowly. She has a congenital heart condition. It's manageable for now, but it's serious. She's had fainting spells, fatigue, shortness of breath. We've been monitoring it for years. Specialists, medications, regular checkups. He felt cold all over. Why didn't you tell me this yesterday? I didn't want to overwhelm you, she said. I didn't want you to think I was telling you just to guilt you into staying. His mind raced. How bad is it? She's stable, Emily said, trying to sound calm, but her voice wavered. But we're running out of time. The last appointment wasn't good. Her cardiologist said we might need to start preparing for the transplant list soon. And that's a whole different world of complications. Nick leaned forward, hands clasped tightly. Jesus. Emily. I've done everything I could, she said, her voice cracking for the first time. I've drained my savings, taken extra jobs, applied for every state assistance program I could find. But I'm scared, Nick. I'm so scared. And I'm so tired of doing it alone. He stood and walked over to her, kneeling in front of the chair. You're not alone anymore. She looked at him, searching his face for signs of doubt, of hesitation. But he didn't flinch. I want to help you, he said. I want to help her. I'll pay for the best doctors, the best treatment, anything she needs. I'll move heaven and earth for that little girl. Tears finally spilled down Emily's cheeks. I just want her to live. Nick reached for her hands, holding them in his. She will. We're going to make sure of it. Together. And for the first time since they reconnected, something between them shifted. Not back to what they had before, but into something new. Something forged not in passion, but in purpose. Just then, a soft voice came from the hallway. Mommy? They both turned. Sophie stood there in her pajamas, clutching her bunny, her hair tousled, her eyes still heavy with sleep. When she saw Nick, her face lit up. Hi, Daddy, she said. And just like that, the world stopped again. Not in fear or shock this time, but in something so pure, so powerful, that Nick thought his heart might break from the weight of it. He crossed the room, scooped her up gently, and held her against his chest. Hi, sweetheart, he whispered. I'm here. Later that week, Nick found himself pacing outside the Children's Cardiology Center, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his tailored coat, shoulders tense despite the warm afternoon sun. Just beyond the glass doors of the clinic, Sophie sat inside a cheerful waiting room filled with pastel-colored furniture, fish tanks, and the distant hum of cartoons playing on a wall-mounted TV. She was coloring a picture of a unicorn, her tongue peeking slightly from the corner of her mouth as she focused. Emily sat beside her, keeping an eye on the door every now and then, her face unreadable. Nick had promised himself that he would be strong for both of them. Calm, reassuring, dependable. But now, as the minutes ticked by before Sophie's name would be called, he realized this wasn't a meeting or a negotiation. This was something he couldn't control, couldn't outsmart or outspend into submission. This was his daughter's heart, failing, and he'd never felt so helpless in his life. Just a few days earlier, Emily had agreed to let Nick get involved in Sophie's treatment, and since then, things had moved fast. Nick had flown in two of the country's leading pediatric cardiologists to review her case. One was from Boston, the other from Houston. Her records were digitized, shared, analyzed. MRI scans, EKGs, blood work, all reviewed in record time. When Nick threw resources at a problem, the world responded. But even with all of it, the answer they got was the one Emily had feared for years, and the one Nick could barely bring himself to accept. Sophie would need a heart transplant. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. Her condition was deteriorating faster than expected. Her little heart was too weak, and the medications were becoming less effective. There was a window, perhaps a few months at most, during which they had to act. The problem was heart transplants for children weren't like adult procedures. The donor list was small, the criteria strict. Timing, compatibility, and pure luck all played critical roles. And while Nick had the money, the connections, and the influence to move mountains, even he couldn't manufacture a matching heart out of thin air. The door to the clinic buzzed open, and Emily stepped outside, wrapping her arms around herself. Her expression was calm, but he could tell it was taking every ounce of strength she had not to fall apart. She's in with the nurse, she said softly. Vitals, more tests. They'll call us in soon. Nick nodded. I hate this. I know, she whispered. He looked at her then, really looked. The way her face had thinned slightly from stress, how the skin under her eyes had grown darker, how her voice trembled even when her words were steady. She had done all of this alone, for 5 years, and now she was still standing. "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for," he said. She gave him a sad smile. "I didn't really have a choice." He took a step closer. "You do now. You have me." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "I want to believe that." "You can," he said. "I'm not walking away. Not now. Not ever." Before she could answer, the nurse stepped into the doorway, calling Sophie's name. The two of them followed her inside and found Sophie already perched on the edge of the examination table, swinging her legs slightly. She smiled when she saw them. Nick sat beside her, taking her small hand in his. "You ready, kiddo?" Sophie nodded with bright eyes. "Do I get a sticker again?" Emily laughed softly. "If you're brave." "I'm always brave," Sophie said with a confident nod. When the doctor came in, he greeted them with quiet warmth and got straight to the point. He explained that Sophie's latest test confirmed what they had suspected. The window for medical management was closing. They would need to begin the process of registering her for the transplant list immediately. The room grew still. Nick felt a coldness in his chest, but he stayed quiet, focusing on Sophie, on her tiny hand still wrapped in his. "We'll take care of everything," he said after a long pause, looking at the doctor. "Paperwork, insurance, travel. I don't care where the donor is. We'll go. We'll wait." The doctor nodded, already used to Nick's tone. "We'll start the listing today." That night, Nick sat in the back of the car with Sophie asleep in his lap, her head resting on his chest. Emily sat across from them, her fingers wrapped around a thermos of tea. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The car moved silently through the dark city, the headlights tracing shadows on the buildings as they passed. Finally, Nick broke the silence. "Do you remember that night in Chicago?" he asked, his voice low. Emily looked up slowly. "Of course I do. I've thought about it so many times. Wondered why I didn't chase after you. Why I didn't call. I left before sunrise," she said. "I didn't give you a chance." "You didn't think I'd want one." "No," she admitted. "I didn't." Nick looked down at Sophie, her peaceful face nestled into his shirt. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "I don't regret much," he said, "but I regret not finding you sooner." Emily's eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. "You found us now," she whispered. He nodded. "And I'm not letting go." The car pulled up in front of Emily's building. Nick helped carry Sophie upstairs and tucked her into bed, brushing a kiss against her temple as she murmured sleepily and turned over. As he stood in the doorway of her bedroom, watching the soft rise and fall of her breath, something clicked inside him. Something final and absolute. This was what he was made for. Not headlines, not fortune, not power, her, them, a family. And he would do whatever it took to keep that heart, the one that beat in Sophie's tiny chest, safe, strong, and beating for as long as she lived. The call came on a Tuesday morning just as Nick was about to walk into a board meeting. He had barely glanced at his phone, expecting it to be a routine message from his assistant. But when he saw the hospital's number flash across the screen, something in his chest immediately tightened. He stepped out of the glass conference room, ignoring the confused looks from the executives seated around the table, and answered the call. "Mr. Bennett?" "Yes, this is Nick. This is Dr. Alvarez from the transplant team at Seattle Children's. We've received notice of a potential donor heart for Sophie. It's early, and nothing is guaranteed yet, but it's a viable match." For a moment, Nick couldn't speak. A donor heart. It was the one thing they had been hoping for, praying for, dreading to need and yet desperate to receive. The weeks since Sophie had been listed for transplant had been a blur of waiting. Days that moved like years, filled with test results, doctor appointments, and quiet, painful hope. "How soon?" Nick finally managed. "We'll need to move quickly. The heart is being retrieved now. If it meets final standards, we'll notify you within the hour. Once confirmed, Sophie needs to be prepped immediately. Surgery will follow within 6 to 8 hours. Nick didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." He didn't bother explaining to anyone in the office why he was leaving. He walked out, climbed into the back of his car, and called Emily on the way. Her voice cracked when he told her. She had no words at first. Just a breathless silence followed by a whisper. "Are you sure?" "Not yet," he said, "but almost." The next few hours passed in a haze of preparation. Sophie had been kept at the hospital the night before for monitoring, and when Nick and Emily arrived at her room, she was sitting upright in bed, drawing on a whiteboard with one of the nurses. Nick knelt beside her. "Hey, sweetheart," he said. Sophie grinned. "Guess what? I beat Nurse Kelly at tic-tac-toe 3 times." He smiled, brushing a hand gently over her hair. "That's because you're a genius." She giggled. Then she looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. A seriousness he wasn't used to seeing in a child so small. "You look nervous," she said. Nick glanced at Emily, then back at Sophie. He took her hand in his. "There's a heart," he said. "A real one. And it might be the right one for you." Sophie stared at him for a second. "Does that mean I'll be better?" "It means," he said slowly, voice thick with emotion, "that if everything goes right, yes, you'll be a lot better. You'll have more energy. You'll be able to run, to ride horses like you always talk about. You'll get to grow up." She was quiet. Then she nodded, slowly and very seriously. "I want that," she said. "I want that too," Nick said. "More than anything." An hour later, the final call came. The heart was viable. A match. The transplant team sprang into motion. Sophie was given pre-op medications. Doctors explained the procedure. Emily signed the forms with trembling hands. Nick stood next to her, steadying her as she gripped the pen like it was the only thing anchoring her to the world. They both knew what the risks were. No transplant was guaranteed. But the alternative was far worse. When the surgical team came to take Sophie to the operating room, she hugged both of them tightly. "I'm not scared," she whispered. "You're here." Nick bent down, kissed her forehead. Always! They watched as the doors closed behind her. And then began the longest night of their lives. Nick and Emily sat in a quiet waiting area far from the main lobby, where the lights were dim and the world felt slower. Neither of them said much. There were no more words left. Only waiting. Every hour a nurse came with an update. She was stable. The heart had arrived. The team was working carefully. No complications? Yet. Nick stared at the same spot on the floor for so long, it became etched into his vision. Emily sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, eyes red but dry. They held hands without even realizing it, their fingers locked together tightly. At some point in the early hours of the morning, Dr. Alvarez appeared in the doorway. They both stood instantly. "She's out of surgery," he said, "and it was a success." Emily covered her mouth, her knees almost giving out. Nick caught her as the breath she'd been holding finally released. "The heart took beautifully. Her vitals are strong. We'll keep her sedated for now, but if everything continues like this, she'll wake up in the next 24 to 48 hours. Nick didn't speak. Couldn't. He just nodded, tears burning behind his eyes, his body shaking from the weight of it all. "You can see her in recovery soon," the doctor added gently. "She did incredibly well." When they were finally led into the recovery room, Nick stood at Sophie's bedside in awe. Tubes and monitors surrounded her, but her face, peaceful, calm, strong, was all he saw. He reached for her hand, holding it delicately, not wanting to disturb a single part of her. "You did it, baby," he whispered. "You did it." Emily stood on the other side, watching her daughter with a mother's love that had survived years of fear and sacrifice. And in that room, in that quiet moment, the three of them stood not as pieces of a broken past, but as something whole, a family. One stitched together not by perfection, but by love, relentless, enduring, and newly alive. The first sign that Sophie was waking up came in the form of a faint flicker beneath her closed eyelids. Nick saw it immediately. He had barely moved from the chair beside her bed in the recovery unit. For nearly 30 hours, he had sat there, watching, waiting, praying silently in a way he didn't even know he was capable of. His suit jacket was folded neatly over the back of the chair. His shirt was wrinkled. His eyes were bloodshot. None of it mattered. Emily had spent most of the night curled up on a hospital cot in the corner, refusing to leave the room even when the nurses gently suggested rest. But when Nick leaned forward suddenly, reaching instinctively for Sophie's hand, she bolted upright. "She's moving," he whispered. Emily was beside him in seconds. Sophie's small fingers twitched inside Nick's hand, weak but unmistakable. Her lashes fluttered, and then, slowly, her eyes opened. They were slightly unfocused at first, hazy from the sedation, but within seconds they locked onto Nick's face. She blinked once, then again. Her lips parted and the faintest whisper came out. "Daddy?" Nick choked on a breath, his vision instantly clouded by tears. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You're okay. You made it." Sophie's gaze moved to Emily, who had tears silently streaming down her face. "Mommy." Emily leaned in, pressing a kiss to her daughter's temple. "You were so brave," she whispered. "We're so proud of you." Sophie's lips curved into the tiniest smile. Her voice was raspy, barely audible. "Does this mean I get to ride horses now?" Nick laughed through the tears, overwhelmed by the purity of the moment. "You can do anything now, kiddo," he said. "You've got a brand new heart." The next few days were a slow, careful miracle. Sophie's strength returned gradually. First in small things, staying awake for more than 10 minutes, sipping water without nausea, holding her bunny again. Then bigger things, sitting up with help, watching cartoons, asking questions about the world outside the hospital room. Nick and Emily took turns by her side, creating a rhythm that didn't need to be spoken. Nick brought her favorite coloring books and plush toys from every store he could find. Emily brought familiarity, songs from home, silly voices, bedtime stories whispered into her ear while monitors clicked and beeped. One night, when Sophie had finally fallen into a peaceful sleep, Nick stepped into the hallway, needing a moment to breathe. Emily followed him, pulling her cardigan tightly around her. They stood together in the corridor, soft yellow lights casting long shadows against the walls. The hospital was quiet, the storm that had raged around them slowly calming into something softer. "She looks stronger already," Nick said. Emily nodded. "She is." There was a pause. "You saved her life," she said suddenly. Nick turned to her, surprised by the finality in her voice. "No," he said. "We saved her. You were there every step. You fought for her long before I even knew she existed." "You could have walked away," Emily whispered. "Most people would have. A daughter you didn't even know about. A sick child. A scared mother." He shook his head. "I didn't walk away because the moment I saw her, I knew I couldn't live without her. Or without you." She looked at him then, her expression softer than it had been in days. Tired but open. "She's going to need both of us," she said. "She'll have us," he promised. They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. They just stood side by side in the hallway, listening to the steady beat of Sophie's new heart from the room beyond. It was the sound of possibility, of a future. The next morning, Sophie was well enough to sit up on her own, and when a nurse came in with a breakfast tray, she looked at it with wide eyes and announced, "I want pancakes." Nick grinned. "Real ones or hospital ones?" Sophie wrinkled her nose. "Real ones." "Then as soon as we get you home," he said, "I'll make you the best pancakes in the world." "Do you even know how to cook?" she asked skeptically. Emily laughed from her chair. "Not well." "I'll learn," Nick said, holding up a hand. "Scout's honor." Later that day, the doctors came in with news that made all three of them smile. If her progress continued at this pace, Sophie could be discharged within a week. There would be follow-ups, medication, and careful monitoring for months, maybe years. But the worst was behind them. Sophie clapped her hands softly when she heard the news. "Can we go to the zoo after I leave the hospital?" "Yes," Nick said instantly. "And ice cream?" "Absolutely." Emily raised an eyebrow. "He's going to spoil you." Sophie leaned back against her pillows, eyes shining. "I think I like being spoiled." Nick looked between them. Emily's soft laughter, Sophie's joy, the soft glow of late morning light on the bedsheets, and something inside him settled. For the first time in a very long time, he felt still. Not restless, not climbing, not running, just present, alive, complete. And in that moment, he realized something simple and true. The life he had always wanted had been waiting for him all along. Not in boardrooms or private jets, not in headlines or numbers, but here, in this tiny room, with a child's new heart beating strong and steady, and the two people who had finally made him whole. It had been 3 months since Sophie's surgery. The world had changed in a way that no one watching from the outside might fully understand. The headlines had faded. The photographers had long since moved on. The media had covered the miracle of the billionaire's long-lost daughter and her life-saving transplant, then let the story drift downstream like every other brief, human interest tale. But inside the quiet corners of one lakeside house outside of Seattle, life was just beginning. Nick stood barefoot in the kitchen, the morning sun casting long golden lines across the floor. The scent of coffee drifted through the air, mingling with something warm and sweet. Pancakes again. He had perfected them. Sophie insisted on them at least twice a week. Chocolate chip, banana, even blueberry when she was in a fancy mood. She sat now at the kitchen island, kicking her legs, already halfway through her second helping, hair still a little wild from sleep. Emily leaned against the doorframe, coffee mug in hand, wearing an oversized sweater and leggings, her expression soft and amused as she watched the two of them argue about whether syrup went on before or after the whipped cream. "Syrup first," Nick said, flipping another pancake onto a plate. "Nope," Sophie countered confidently, pointing with her fork. "Whipped cream first, or it melts weird. I'm a CEO. I make serious decisions." "You're a pancake rookie," she shot back with a smirk. Emily laughed. Nick just raised his hands in surrender. There was lightness in their mornings now. Real, lived-in joy. Sophie's cheeks were full of color. Her eyes sparkled when she talked. Her steps were no longer slow and cautious, but full of life. Sometimes even too fast for Nick's peace of mind. She still had regular checkups. There were pills she had to take, blood pressure to monitor, a strict diet they followed to the letter. But her heart, her new heart, beat strong. They had made it through the storm. Outside, the lake shimmered beneath a clear sky, and a garden Emily had started growing was already showing signs of life. Tomatoes, herbs, even sunflowers reaching toward the sky. Sophie had her own patch, of course, where she'd planted carrots and named each one. After breakfast, the three of them took a walk down to the water. It had become a ritual. Slow, quiet mornings by the lake. Nick held Sophie's hand as she skipped along the path, the stuffed white bunny still a constant presence tucked under her arm. "You know," Sophie said suddenly, stopping to stare at the water, "I think hearts are kind of like gardens." Nick blinked. "How do you mean?" She gave him a look that said he should already understand. "You have to take care of them, water them, protect them, but also let them grow." Emily looked over at Nick, eyes soft, touched with something like awe. "That's beautiful," he said, kneeling beside her. Sophie shrugged like it was nothing. "I've had a lot of time to think. Hospitals are boring." They sat by the dock for a long time, feet dangling above the water. Nick glanced at Emily, her blonde hair catching the sunlight, her face more relaxed than he'd seen in years. There was still exhaustion there. Years of stress don't disappear in one season. But now there was peace too, laughter, hope. Later that day, they unpacked a few last boxes, items Emily and Sophie had brought with them when they moved in permanently just a few weeks earlier. Nick had offered to build them a new house, bigger, more glamorous, with every luxury possible. But Emily said no. This place was enough. This place was real. In Sophie's new bedroom, the walls were already covered in hand-drawn pictures, a paper heart collage, a photo of the three of them at the zoo, a framed piece of construction paper where Sophie had written in colorful marker, "My heart is happy now." Nick couldn't stop staring at that one. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the house filled with golden light, they sat around the fire pit outside. Sophie roasted marshmallows, giggling each time one caught fire, and Nick told her he'd once burned an entire steak during a very fancy business dinner. She howled with laughter. Emily watched them quietly for a moment before leaning toward Nick. "You know," she said, "I think you've finally found your real job." He looked at her, puzzled. "Oh yeah," she nodded. "Being a dad." Nick glanced at Sophie, who was now drawing a smiley face on a graham cracker with chocolate. "It's the best job I've ever had," he said honestly, "and the only one that matters now." That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Bunny still tucked under one arm, a stack of picture books scattered on the floor, Nick and Emily sat together on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. "You still think you're just visiting this life?" she asked gently. He shook his head. I think this is the first time I've ever really arrived." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "We're lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," he whispered. You both saved me. I just didn't know I needed saving. They sat in silence after that. Not an empty silence, but a full one. The kind that needs no words. The kind that says, we made it. And as the wind rustled gently through the trees and the soft hum of the lake echoed in the night, Nick closed his eyes for a moment and listened to it all. The rhythm of peace, of family, of love. The sound of a heart, finally whole. It had been 3 months since Sophie's surgery. The world had changed in a way that no one watching from the outside might fully understand. The headlines had faded. The photographers had long since moved on. The media had covered the miracle of the billionaire's long-lost daughter and her life-saving transplant, then let the story drift downstream like every other brief human interest tale. But inside the quiet corners of one lakeside house outside of Seattle, life was just beginning. Nick stood barefoot in the kitchen, the morning sun casting long golden lines across the floor. The scent of coffee drifted through the air, mingling with something warm and sweet. Pancakes again. He had perfected them. Sophie insisted on them at least twice a week. Chocolate chip, banana, even blueberry when she was in a fancy mood. She sat now at the kitchen island, kicking her legs, already halfway through her second helping, hair still a little wild from sleep. Emily leaned against the doorframe, coffee mug in hand, wearing an oversized sweater and leggings, her expression soft and amused as she watched the two of them argue about whether syrup went on before or after the whipped cream. Syrup first, Nick said, flipping another pancake onto a plate. Nope, Sophie countered confidently, pointing with her fork. Whipped cream first, or it melts weird. I'm a CEO. I make serious decisions. You're a pancake rookie, she shot back with a smirk. Emily laughed. Nick just raised his hands in surrender. There was lightness in their mornings now. Real, lived-in joy. Sophie's cheeks were full of color. Her eyes sparkled when she talked. Her steps were no longer slow and cautious, but full of life. Sometimes even too fast for Nick's peace of mind. She still had regular checkups. There were pills she had to take, blood pressure to monitor, a strict diet they followed to the letter. But her heart, her new heart, beat strong. They had made it through the storm. Outside, the lake shimmered beneath a clear sky, and a garden Emily had started growing was already showing signs of life. Tomatoes, herbs, even sunflowers reaching toward the sky. Sophie had her own patch, of course, where she'd planted carrots and named each one. After breakfast, the three of them took a walk down to the water. It had become a ritual. Slow, quiet mornings by the lake. Nick held Sophie's hand as she skipped along the path, the stuffed white bunny still a constant presence tucked under her arm. You know, Sophie said suddenly, stopping to stare at the water, I think hearts are kind of like gardens. Nick blinked. How do you mean? She gave him a look that said he should already understand. You have to take care of them, water them, protect them, but also let them grow. Emily looked over at Nick, eyes soft, touched with something like awe. That's beautiful, he said, kneeling beside her. Sophie shrugged like it was nothing. I've had a lot of time to think. Hospitals are boring. They sat by the dock for a long time, feet dangling above the water. Nick glanced at Emily, her blonde hair catching the sunlight, her face more relaxed than he'd seen in years. There was still exhaustion there. Years of stress don't disappear in one season. But now there was peace too, laughter, hope. Later that day, they unpacked a few last boxes, items Emily and Sophie had brought with them when they moved in permanently just a few weeks earlier. Nick had offered to build them a new house, bigger, more glamorous, with every luxury possible. But Emily said no. This place was enough. This place was real. In Sophie's new bedroom, the walls were already covered in hand-drawn pictures, a paper heart collage, a photo of the three of them at the zoo, a framed piece of construction paper where Sophie had written in colorful marker, "My heart is happy now." Nick couldn't stop staring at that one. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the house filled with golden light, they sat around the fire pit outside. Sophie roasted marshmallows, giggling each time one caught fire, and Nick told her he'd once burned an entire steak during a very fancy business dinner. She howled with laughter. Emily watched them quietly for a moment before leaning toward Nick. You know, she said, I think you've finally found your real job. He looked at her, puzzled. Oh, yeah? She nodded. Being a dad. Nick glanced at Sophie, who was now drawing a smiley face on a graham cracker with chocolate. It's the best job I've ever had, he said honestly, and the only one that matters now. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Bunny still tucked under one arm, a stack of picture books scattered on the floor. Nick and Emily sat together on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. You still think you're just visiting this life? She asked gently. He shook his head. Number, I think this is the first time I've ever really arrived. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. We're lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one, he whispered. You both saved me. I just didn't know I needed saving. They sat in silence after that, not an empty silence, but a full one, the kind that needs no words, the kind that says, we made it. And as the wind rustled gently through the trees and the soft hum of the lake echoed in the night, Nick closed his eyes for a moment and listened to it all. The rhythm of peace, of family, of love. The sound of a heart finally whole. The beauty of this ending lies not in grand gestures or cinematic drama, but in quiet transformation. What began as a tale of power, absence, and hidden truths slowly unfolded into something intimate, vulnerable, and deeply human. Nick's journey is not just about discovering he has a daughter. It's about rediscovering himself through her. In a world where wealth often isolates rather than connects, this story shows us that real richness comes from showing up, from making pancakes at 7 a.m., from learning to listen, from sitting in silence next to a hospital bed. It's a story of redemption without a fall from grace, the redemption of a man who didn't break the world, but simply never noticed how empty his own had become. The final chapters don't scream for attention. They breathe. They give space for healing, for love to settle into the corners of a life that had long been hollow. And perhaps that's what makes the ending so powerful. Not that Nick becomes a hero, but that he becomes a father. Not by title, but by choice. Day after day, the story reminds us that some miracles aren't sudden. They grow slowly, through hard decisions, quiet courage, and the love we choose again and again, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard, it's a happy ending. But not because everything is perfect, rather because it's finally real.